Hey guys, it's Sam, and these are my most recent reads. I let this go a little too long again, so there's a decent amount, so I'm breaking this into two parts. So you'll see one part now, and one part probably in a few weeks. When I do that, it does deceive me though, because I'm like, I just did one, when really it's like a month's worth of stuff is building up. So this is almost 2 months worth of books. Almost. The first book I read was The Drowned Woods by Emily Lloyd-Jones. This is a companion story set in the same world as The Bone Houses, which I have not read, but I probably would like. This is set in a, like, fantastical Wales. Wales is kind of fantastical as it is, but like extra fantastical Wales, in which there are magic users that are called diviners. Our main character of Mare is a water diviner, and she was sort of put in service of the prince, who's a kind of a bad dude, for a long time, ran away, and then gets kind of pulled back in because she's always like on the run, and so ends up having to do a like heist slash like set in a dark fairy tale world, get like a motley crew together. Her former sort of like spy master teams up with her. They have to track down like a fey cursed prince, another like former lover of hers, and all this stuff. So like it ends up being this ragtag crew to go on a heist to try to take down this prince so he stops chasing her, and also he's just like a bad dude and people don't like him. This was a solid YA fantasy, maybe upper YA, honestly. I think they're a little bit older, but this was just like, if you're craving that like early 2010s good YA, you know, like the glory period of YA, I almost should do a video on some of those books because I miss them. The things that I used to really like when I first joined BookTube, let's say. If you're missing that, that's like kind of this flavor of thing. It's just solid. It has a solid plot. The fantasy is like good. It's light on the romance. There's a little bit of romance, but not too much. It's definitely not like romantic-y, and has just like, again, this heist plot that's always really kind of fun and sort of like found family-ish vibes. And yeah, it's just like overall really good time. So I enjoyed this, and I would, again, read The Bone Houses, which I think is a little bit more like spooky. But overall, if you're looking for just like a solid YA fantasy, this is definitely one to go for. I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. Next is Malice by John Gwynne. I already have a full review for this, so I will link that on the screen for you to check out. Full spoiler-free review. But this is the first book in a 4-book adult fantasy series. Kit has a lot to say, as always. And this is following, like, I think in total like 6 or 7 POVs, all in this sort of Norse, Viking-esque, but there's also some Roman influences, inspired world. And it's mostly like men, and it's like war is coming, like the dark times are sort of rising. So this is the beginning as everything's sort of falling apart, and then you kind of can tell that there's going to be this like big cataclysmic thing, and all of the different POVs are going to converge. They converge a little bit here, but there's even more so, I know, over time. And it's interesting because I tried to read this a few years ago for the first time and didn't enjoy it, put it down, but felt like I would enjoy it another time. Picked it back up, and I had forgotten everything the first time reading it, and this time, like, it's very clear in my mind. So it just goes to show that, like, certain books you have to read at certain times. But this definitely had a few elements that were weaker. This is his debut novel. Since then, John Gwynne has written, like, a bunch of books. He's finished this series and then finished a second series recently. But this had characters that were interesting and that I'm curious about how they're going to, like, grow and develop. This had a lot of just, like, how all of these characters are going to come together, how all these things are impacting different people in different parts of the world, how those storylines eventually converge. The one weakness, I would say, is that some of the things feel very similar, and in particular, there were a few characters who kind of had like overlapping, very similar plot points and things. Like there's like bullying plot that happens in 2 different characters with like 2 different settings. You're kind of like, why make bullying the main thing in 2? But yeah, so like that was a thing, but overall, especially the end, like how everything kind of came together, how you start to see how everything's going to fall apart, how you're starting to see like how these different characters are going to react to things, all that's very interesting. So this is just a lot of setup for the rest of the series. And everyone that I've talked to has been like, the rest of the series is really good, so I'm looking forward to this, and his next series is even better. So yeah, I am firmly in a John Gwynne camp, but I will say this is grimdark-esque, so like triggers in here for death of children, lots of death of animals, lots of dog death. No dog deaths that are main characters or anything, so not dogs that you're like super attached to, but I'm super attached to all dogs, so a lot of dog death and bullying and gore. So it's just know that this is like the rise of a god war, essentially. Yeah, I didn't mention the gods are part of this too. So yeah, I'm very intrigued to see where this is going to go. We don't have a lot of answers now, nor should we, but looking forward to the rest of the series. And again, I have a full review if you're interested. I then listened to The Reluctant Queen by Sarah Beth Durst. This is the second book in the Queens of Renthia series, and this was a solid middle book. I can't go into a ton of detail because it would give spoilers for the first book, but this is set in a world in which there are spirits. It's sort of like animism. There are spirits in everything, and those spirits are like manifest. So there's like wood spirits and earth spirits and water spirits and air spirits, and the queen of this area, or of any area because it's actually a larger area, but we mainly just follow like the one place. There's a queen that can control the spirits and keep them from killing people, because if they're just left to their own devices, they will just like kill everything and constantly be destroying and creating things. And so the queen lets them do that. So in this book, we have more of an expansion on like the queen, what happens in the first book, our same characters in the first book, then we get to follow more characters in this book. In this book, what's interesting is that the first book we have like just a older male mentor character and then this woman who may be a potential queen. In this one we still have them, but then we have this older woman, like middle-aged, like she's like a mother, but like a maternal figure, and she has kids. And so you also get like her perspective, and so it's much more of like an older feeling series, and the fact that like these characters are firmly adults. Like our main character from the first book is like a young adult, you know, like maybe 19, 20, but then the rest of these characters are like 30s and 40s and stuff. So this was cool because it just had that different perspective, and you were following a main character who's a mom that I don't think you get very often. We're getting it more, but not as much as we get other characters that are like teens and young adults. So I enjoyed this installment and gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Then we have Medusas Sisters by Laura J.A. Bear. I also listened to this on audio. This is one of those classical myth retellings that is fleshing out the story of lesser known characters within mythology. In this case, this is Medusas Sisters. So Medusa has 2 Gorgon sisters, and this is like their, you know, a story that's kind of based off of some of like riffing off of some of the myths and things. So if you like that kind of thing, you would probably like this. I do think this one is weaker, although not the weakest of this subgenre that I've read. This one has an interesting take because it's not following Medusa, but Medusa is a part of a lot of it, and she is sort of this like haunting the narrative character. So her 2 sisters talk about her a lot, have different relationships with her, and we are ultimately following like Medusa's story through them, but also how they're impacting that story and how they're impacting their own story. And so we follow this myth. So if you're familiar with like the Medusa myth or take some of the Medusa myth, you might already know this, but there are triggers in here for rape, a lot of misogyny, and pregnancy and death of children. But while this had a lot of potential in some ways, just because like Medusa sisters are cool characters, I do think that this genre is getting like a little bit oversaturated, or we're really kind of like grasping at straws in some cases. And this felt like the characters were a little bit flat and they couldn't quite carry the story for how long it was. And it's not that long of a book, but I do feel like it could have been shorter. And then there were some character growth moments, but it felt very rushed and like kind of unbelievable. So yeah, ultimately these characters felt a little flat, and that's what I feel like tends to happen when these, like this subgenre of book falls flat. It's usually because the characters feel very flat. You really have to have, for something like this, which is definitely more of a character study than a plot-driven thing, you have to have really strong, compelling characters. And I think it's hard for authors to kind of like trade off basing it kind of on a myth but not having a ton of information, and it's just like hard for them to make fully fleshed out, organic seeming characters. So this one I gave like 2.75 stars. Next we have Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia Fairies by Heather Fawcett. This I've already done a full spoiler-free review on. I think it'll be posted before this, so I'll link that on the screen. This is following our main character, Emily Wilde, who is a like fairy scientist, fairy biologist. I think they're called dryadologists, I think. But she wants to study fairies, so she's going to this certain area, and she's been studying fairies for a while. She's like a known scholar. So she goes to a certain area, and this is her like journal of her experience with these fae in kind of like a Nordic setting, I would say. I'm not sure exactly where it's supposed to be. It's like a fantasy more setting. But she wants to follow this particular kind of fae, and so she's like getting to know the villagers. She's staying in a certain place, but very soon after she arrives, her friend slash political rival appears, and she's like, oh my god, he's gonna try to steal my credit. So we have this like fairy fae story, and these are like fae that are like, you know, mischievous and conniving and sometimes evil and whatever, and like just any kind of like fairy tale really. And then we have sort of this like rivals to lovers situation where you're not really sure how it's gonna go. And I really enjoyed this. This was very fun. This has a cozy element, but there still is some danger involved because it's the fae. I liked all of our characters. They all felt really fleshed out. I really liked our main character. She has this, she's like autistic coded really. They never really say, but she's like, I have a really hard time, you know, talking to people and getting to know people, and I misread social cues and whatever. She just is like very hyper fixated on fairies. And so it's really cool to have this character that is just like, hey, this is what I'm really into, and I don't really necessarily care about people all the time. Like I do in my own way, and just like the cultivation of that and like how that was on the page was really cool. And then I liked our like love interest rival character guy as well. So this overall was so much fun. The setting was fun, like everything was good. Very like cozy adjacent academic kind of fantasy with a little bit of a love story mixed in. Not super heavy on the romance though, like very slow burn. The only thing that I thought was a little bit weak and that kept it from being a full 5 stars, because I gave this 4.75 stars, was that the ending felt very rushed. I think this is duology if not more. I think the second book is already out, but the ending felt like just very rushed and then done, and it felt very abrupt. So that was the only thing that kept it from being a full 5 stars. But I truly think it's like 5 stars in my heart. Honestly, that's just like the one thing that holds it back. Then I continue with the Queen's Renthea series and finish it up with The Queen of Sorrow by Sarah Beth Durst. This is the final book in the series, and again, can't talk about much plot detail wise, but we have some additional characters in addition to the characters that were in the second book, and this fell a little flat for me. There's things about like what was happening in the character choices that just felt like a little rushed. There were things that felt not quite explained. There were things about this world that just felt like we opened up a lot in this last book. This is like a problem that I have with adult fantasy books. Sometimes they do this. They like kind of run out of things in their main like location, and so they expand out to other locations, but then they don't flesh out those other locations enough, and we don't have enough time because it's the final book, and so we don't get more, and it just feels a little bit like incomplete. So yeah, I would say that like we introduced so much that characters started to like not get enough time, settings started to not get enough time, and it just kind of like fell a little flat. Overall, 3 out of 5 stars, not the worst. And I would say the overall series is like between a 3 and a 4, maybe like a 3, 3.5 overall. So still like a solid adult fantasy series. I'm gonna be doing a full review for the entire series. So if you want more thoughts on this series overall, I will let you know that. But 3 out of 5 stars for this one. Then I DNF'd Starter Villain by John Scalzi. This was a book that we were going to read for book club in October, I think. And I just was not into it. I could tell I was gonna push myself through it. This felt like the Kaiju Preservation Society, which I'm pointing to because it's behind me, because I enjoyed that book, for like a 3-star book. Felt like that with just a new skin on it. It's basically Guy realizes that his uncle is a supervillain and left him his estate, which is kind of similar in feel to Guy realizes Kaiju are real and starts working there. Like it felt like, I know that sounds like those are different plots, but the way that he executed them were like pretty much entirely the same. And just like, person who doesn't know about cool science-y thing gets thrown into that world. And I was like, you know what? I liked that with the Kaiju because I think Kaiju are cool. Supervillains? I don't really care. Like, they can be cool in concept. I think they're a little bit hokey in actual execution, at least in a lot of books that I have seen. So I was just like, you know what? This is not going to be for me. So I DNF'd this. I think I got 50% of the way through, maybe, and I was also like, not a lot is happening, and I don't care, and I don't care about these characters, and it's going to be super forgettable, and I'm not going to continue. So yeah, DNF'd this one. And then finally, I read Nonviolent Communication by an author that I'm forgetting because I don't have it right in front of me because I've already lent it to somebody else. And this is a book that I'll talk about more in depth on my Patreon because all of my like sort of psychology, nonfiction-y, witchcrafty, this is not witchcraft, but like all of those sort of like nonfiction books I'm talking about more on Patreon in depth and making videos for. But this is a book about nonviolent communication, which is a communication tool for communicating in a way that is non-punitive, more restorative justice-y, just in personal connections and stuff. So this is a framework for that. I found this to be great. I gave this like a 4.5 star. The last part of it, to keep it from being a total 5, was that the last handful of chapters just felt like a little bit redundant and just like kind of beating a dead horse, like we get it, this method works, but he was just kind of going over all the ways that he's used it in different settings and whatever. So really like the first like 5 or 6 chapters are like the meat of it, and that was really good. I tabbed up so much of it. I have lent it out already to multiple people. I have other people that want to read it. I use it in my work in therapy. I use it in my personal relationships just even in the last month that I have read it. Really good. So I highly recommend this if you struggle with communication at all, which I don't struggle with it, but I wanted a different model, and this is a very effective one that's simple, but also hard, because we are not taught to communicate in any way, but especially in a way like this. But yeah, more in-depth thoughts on my Patreon if you're interested. So that is it for part 1 of my recent reads. Comment down below, let me know what reading you have gotten up to lately. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys soon. Bye.